Excellent. So with that, we're going to start our Baltimore History Evening. Uh, what we normally do here is we have our presenter talk. So we would just ask that you stay muted during the presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to drop those in the chat. We will also have time at the end of the presentation for question and answers if you'd like to unmute and ask your question aloud. We have a couple of great co-hosts this evening who are going to be moderating that, that question and answer session at the end. So as I said, if you have any other questions or need any Zoom tech help, feel free to drop something in the chat and we'll try to help you out. Again, thank you all for being here and welcome to our May Baltimore History Evening. I'm going to turn it over now to my fellow board member, David Armenti, to get us started and introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thanks so much, Allison, and good evening to everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. It's really my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Richard Bell, who is a professor of history at the University of Maryland. He's the author of the new book, Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. The book was a finalist for the 2020 George Washington Prize and 2020 Harriet Tubman Prize. Rick has held major research fellowships at Yale, Cambridge, and the Library of Congress. He is the recipient of the National Endowment of the Humanities Public Scholar Award. He serves as a trustee of the Maryland Center for History and Culture and is an elected member of the Massachusetts Historical Society and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. And as far as BCHS goes, Dr. Bell is also the 2021 winner of the Arnold Prize for writing on Baltimore history, which is the part of the motivation for participating in the talk this evening, is an adaptation of that written work. So really awesome to have him with us this evening. And at this point, I'll kick it over to you, Dr. Bell.
All right, thank you, David. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to everyone who made tonight's event possible. It's a real pleasure to be with you guys and talk about a city that I've grown to love a lot since I moved to Maryland about, 15 or 16 years ago. I'm not originally from Maryland, as some of you who don't know me can probably figure out just by hearing me talk. I'm originally from London, give or take. So I want to quickly begin by sharing my screen here. Always the moment of truth for any Zoom presenter. Is it going to cooperate or not? Let's give it 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. I think now you can see my, yep, I'm getting some thumbs up from the people that know. So this is an adaptation of an essay with a slightly different title than the title you see up on the screen. So this is adapted from an essay called Border State, Border War, Fighting for Freedom and Slavery in Antebellum Maryland. And that essay was commissioned by Charlie Mitchell and Gene Baker, 2 historians of the state of Maryland in the Civil War era, who were putting together a collection of new scholarship on Maryland's place in the Civil War. That volume came out just a few months ago, published by LSU, Louisiana State University Press, to great fanfare, actually, and considerable press coverage, including in the Baltimore Sun. The book in which my essay appears. The book is called The Civil War in Maryland Reconsidered. We may be able to drop a link to that in the chat if you want to see it. And you will find that after my essay, which is the first one, there is a cavalcade of rock star historians making up for my shortcomings in their own essays that follow. For instance, Martha Jones has an essay in there from Johns Hopkins University, one of our leading historians, Jonathan White as well. Many names you will recognize if you care about this stuff, as I know most of you do. So do take a look at that volume. I think everyone will find something in there that appeals to them. So that essay was written for that collection. And that collection is now out, which is wonderful. That essay was the recipient of the BCHS Arnold Prize, which is staggering honor. I was generally knocked off my chair when I found out that this was the winner. And so what I've done for this talk tonight, which is going to last about 45 minutes, is I have focused in on all the Baltimore material from that longer essay, that broader essay about the whole state of Maryland. So you will not hear in tonight's talk anything about the Eastern Shore. You will not hear anything about Hagerstown or the counties that run across the top of the state of Maryland. You will not hear anything about where I am, which is PG County or Montgomery County. What we will try to focus in like a laser is on the city of Baltimore and its immediate hinterland. That's why I've put these words in red to show you how I've changed this presentation. All right, so let me dive in right now, and then with any luck, we can have some comments and questions in the time that remains at the end. I know there's a lot of expertise on Baltimore history on this call. I want you to know up front that I might be the weakest link. So if I get hard questions, I'm going to punt to everyone else and say, can we crowdsource an answer to this? Because the things I don't know about the city of Baltimore could take up many, many volumes. All right, let's get stuck in, folks. For many African Americans, to live in the city of Baltimore in the decades before the Civil War was to live in a waking nightmare. By the 1850s, Baltimore had become a major center for slave trading, a hub for traders who made their livelihoods buying enslaved people from the city and its sprawling hinterland, and then shipping those men, women, and children south to be sold to sugar planters and cotton planters in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And this domestic slave trade, as it's known, was big business, turning profits of $50 to $100 per person. Baltimore's docks had been a primary point of southward embarkation since at least the 1820s. Demand for Black bodies to fill those departing ships was so high in the second quarter of the 19th century that legitimate, in quotation marks, legitimate slave traders sometimes did side deals and bought from kidnappers of free people if the price was right and no one was looking. Oversight of all this was minimal. And on the rare occasions that they were called to account, those supposedly above board dealers in human flesh would simply hide behind the petticoats of national fugitive slave laws, protected by a political and legal establishment in Maryland that treated enslaved men and women as expendable machines and regarded free Black people as nuisance non-citizens. The reality of that nightmare was not always apparent to everyone living in Baltimore or passing through it. During a stay there in 1835, a New England-born lexicographer named Ethan Allen Andrews concluded that in this city, in Baltimore, there appears to be no strong attachment to slavery and no wish to perpetuate it. Others would echo that sentiment over time. And in 1845, John Carey, a Baltimore politician, complained that slavery is a dead weight, and worse, it's become a wasting disease. In a city in which wage labor was the norm, claims like this were quite common. But they obscure the subtle, enduring centrality of slavery to Baltimore's economy in the antebellum era. The city's lawyers and bankers made their money greasing the wheels of the entire Southern slave system. And many of the hulls built at the city's shipyards near the docks were designed to serve the maritime slave trades. Baltimore was also a major processing center for slave-raised cash crops like tobacco, which was grown locally, and cotton, which was grown far away. By 1850, Baltimore was home to 120 cigar-making businesses, as well as factories that produced finished cotton worth more than $1 million each year. Its several thousand enslaved workers were an essential element in Baltimore's labor market too, contributing crucial manpower to its manufacturing, commercial and service sectors. Across the city, enslaved people pressed tobacco leaves, milled wheat, and forged iron. Some worked in construction, shipbuilding, caulking, and sail-making. Many more toiled each day as porters, waiters, servants, cooks, maids, and seamstresses in hotels and restaurants and private homes. The nature of the urban labor market was such that Baltimore's enslaved population often worked side by side with free Black wage earners doing very similar tasks. Now, on the one hand, proximity to that much larger community of free Black people created all sorts of opportunities for enslaved Baltimoreans. Baltimore was the place where enslaved men and women could seek out and join free Black churches and Sunday schools and self-improvement societies and construct all sorts of social ties across the freedom line. When Frederick Douglass was dispatched as an enslaved man to live with Thomas Ould's brother in Fells Point, Douglass would do all that and more. He would teach himself to read while enslaved in Baltimore. He would buy books while enslaved in Baltimore, and he would meet his future wife, Anna Murray, while enslaved at Baltimore, at a gathering of the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, where Frederick was, we think, the only enslaved member. In his memoirs, Douglass recalled his ecstasy when he learned that he was to leave the wheat fields of Talbot County and go to work in this big city. But on the other hand, that move to the city from the country brought dilemmas and dangers of its own. When Douglass arrived in Baltimore, this 18-year-old lad was confronted by troops of hostile boys, ready to pounce on me, he said, at every street corner. They chased me. They called me Eastern Shore man. Till really, I almost wished myself back on the Eastern Shore. Worse was to come for Fred. Hired out to work in William Gardner's shipyard as a caulker, Douglass was beaten savagely by a white journeyman who resented the downward pressure his employment as an enslaved laborer put on their wages. Antebellum Baltimore was intimately connected, not just to the nearby Eastern Shore where Frederick Douglass was from. Antebellum Baltimore was also connected to the Gulf Coast. The American settlers crowding into that ever-expanding region demanded a nearly bottomless supply of forced labor to cut their sugarcane and pick their cotton. They preferred young men, but they would take almost anyone, including women and children. And they would pay top dollar, usually $200 more per person than buyers in more settled regions could afford. With the legal supply of enslaved people limited to American sources, domestic sources, Maryland's plantation owners spent the antebellum decades striking deal after deal with interstate slave traders who were based in Baltimore. Deal after deal to source Black labor for dispatch through Baltimore towards the Deep South. On his visit to Baltimore in 1835, Ethan Allen Andrews counted a dozen or more slave dealers with offices and pens in the city. And each of those slave pens could hold 300 or 400 enslaved captives at once, and was usually strongly built and well supplied, he said, with iron thumb screws and gags, and ornamented with cow skins and other whips, oftentimes bloody. Most of these private slave prisons were concentrated in a few easy-to-find downtown blocks on Lombard Street, Camden Street, and Pratt Street that were close to onward transportation. And these grotesque businesses boomed in the city in the decades before the Civil War. One Baltimore-based trader, Walter Campbell, sent 59 shipments of enslaved people from there to New Orleans alone between 1844 and 1853, carrying about 120 people out of Maryland via Baltimore each year. Despite occasional bans on printing cash for Negroes ads in city newspapers, despite howls of protest from local activists like Hezekiah Niles and Benjamin Lundy and William Lloyd Garrison, despite all of that, the domestic slave trade was a major part of Baltimore's economy. In fact, when Frederick Douglass lived in the city, he was often woken from sleep by, he said, the dead heavy footsteps and the piteous cries of the chained gangs being marched towards the ravenous bellies of the waiting slave ships at Fells Point. The most visible and successful slave dealer in Baltimore in the second quarter of the century was Hope H. Slatter. In the mid-1830s, Slatter set up shop on West Pratt Street between Sharp and Howard, and he did a brisk business there for more than a decade. Slatter specialized in purchasing for the New Orleans market, and he built a state-of-the-art, escape-proof slave pen next to his office that he equipped with separate cell blocks for men and women and an enclosed yard for exercise. Facilities, he boasted, that were not surpassed by any establishment of the kind anywhere else in the United States. He's proud of this. At first, Slatter sent many of his captives to New Orleans by ship, hiring a fleet of omnibuses to carry them down to the docks. Later, Slatter was one of the first Baltimore dealers to commandeer rail cars to dispatch them to New Orleans via the Iron Road. For all these reasons, Slatter was a well-known man about town. He saw himself as a gentleman, providing an essential service. And he made a point of giving tours of his facilities and donating ostentatiously to charity. To the people he bought and sold, however, Slatter was a devil, the stuff of nightmares. Enslaved people were terrified of traders like him, and the constant dread of sale sent some of them mad. Like the man Alexis de Tocqueville met during a tour of the Baltimore Almshouse in 1831. The Negro of whom I speak, Tocqueville later wrote, was terrorized by a vision of a slave dealer who sticks close to him day and night and snatches away bits of his flesh. Enslaved Marylanders did everything in their power to resist these sales or negotiate their terms as best they could. Some tried to argue, some tried to beg. Occasionally that worked, most often it did not. And so when an out-of-state sale seemed inevitable, they sometimes resorted to extreme measures. Lined up at Baltimore's rail depots and wharves with no way back, some cut their throats then and there. Many more, of course, tried to flee, vowing never to be sold south. Enslaved men and women from Maryland and Baltimore frequently fled north instead, turning this city and this state into an epicenter of practical abolition. Frederick Douglass made his first attempt to flee Talbot County in 1836, only to be thwarted there. 2 years later in Baltimore, he tried again. And this time he made it safely to free soil by posing as a sailor and then riding the rails northward towards Wilmington and then Philadelphia and onward. Still, the obstacles to escape far outweighed the opportunities. The distance to the Pennsylvania line was daunting. Even the journey from Baltimore could take 10 days on foot. And the other great obstacle to escape was the law and its many tireless enforcers. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 became the law of the land on, I think, September the 18th, 1850. And its passage marked a major escalation in the border war between the states. 8 days later, a black man from Baltimore named James Hamlet became the first person arrested under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Law. James Hamlet had fled Baltimore 2 years earlier and was living in New York City when a relative of his former enslaver arrived to drag him back. James Hamlet, who was a porter in Manhattan at the time, was apprehended at his place of work, and he was taken before one of the federal commissioners newly appointed under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, James Hamlet protested, of course, but the new law rendered his testimony as a suspected fugitive to be inadmissible. So he was handcuffed and driven to a pier and then stashed on the first steamboat bound back to Baltimore. Fugitive slave renditions like James Hamlet's mushroomed after 1850. And enslavers from our city and region led the charge, crossing state lines in pursuit of runaways and engaging those fugitives in violent and sometimes explosive confrontations on free soil. For example, on September the 11th, 1851, Edward Gorsuch, a Baltimore County wheat farmer and slaveholder, arrived outside a house in Christiana, Pennsylvania, intent on dragging the two runaway enslaved people holed up inside it back across the border into Maryland. Empowered by the new Fugitive Slave Act to do exactly that, Gorsuch was accompanied by a deputy federal marshal and a small posse of armed men. But local opposition in Christiana proved substantial. The town of Christiana, Pennsylvania, was actually a black underground stronghold. And Edward Gorsuch found the stone house heavily fortified, and its occupants, his former slaves and several other black men and women, entrenched and ready to fight. And that's what happened. What began as a tense standoff soon gave way to a full-on firefight, and Gorsuch was shot to death in a hail of gunfire. When his men retreated in panic, the fugitives bolted from the house and made their escape north towards Rochester, New York, where Frederick Douglass would help them find their way to Canada. And Douglass later wrote approvingly of those fugitive Marylanders' courage and resolve, declaring that if it be right for any man to resist those who would enslave them, it was right for the men of color at Christiana to resist. The Christiana fugitives received vital assistance from free black Pennsylvanians. But Baltimore's own black underground was no less numerous. And the city's large and rapidly growing community of free people of color went to extraordinary lengths to help and hide and protect self-emancipating slaves who asked them for assistance. Baltimore was home to several leaders of the black underground. And the city was a haven for fugitives from slavery. Fugitives who, in the words of historian Barbara Fields, had not waited upon the grace of God, the majesty of the law, or the generosity of their owners to grant them freedom. They claimed it for themselves. Indeed, fugitives who could not make it to free soil in Pennsylvania flocked to Baltimore because of the sheer size of the city's free black population. Baltimore was arguably the capital of Black America in the second quarter of the 19th century. Baltimore boasted the largest community of free people of color anywhere in the United States. 15,000 strong, according to the 1830 census. The numbers hit 25,000 by 1850, which was about 15% of the city's entire population. Most of these free Black Baltimoreans were fresh from slavery, drawn to Baltimore by its thriving port, which required deep reserves of cheap labor, and by Baltimore's reputation as the best place in the state and perhaps the nation for free Black Americans to seek economic opportunity and try to carve out a rich family life. The low-cost, flexible labor of free people of color was the backbone of Baltimore's economy. As the city surged, growing to become the second largest in the country by 1840, free Black men drove Baltimore's carts and drays and hacks and coaches and stages. Free Black men made Baltimore's nails and bricks and boots and shoes and brushes and combs and glue and cigars and barrels. Free Black men sawed its wood, whitewashed its walls, cut its stone, blacked its shoes, butchered its meat, smithed its horses, and tanned its skin. A few free Black folk owned and operated their own stores, cook shops, and oyster houses. Others ran basement grog shops or even backstreet brothels. Many more worked at the shipyards as caulkers or carpenters, or as mariners on the ocean-going vessels made and maintained there. The pay packets these men took home were usually modest, so their wives also had to work, typically as cooks, domestics, laundresses, and seamstresses. Beyond their work sites, after work, Black Baltimoreans constructed a vibrant and robust community of freedom. Churches served as important building blocks in this effort. And by the eve of the Civil War, the city boasted 15 free Black meeting houses representing at least 6 denominations. From these houses of worship emerged dozens of mutual aid societies promoting temperance and uplift and charity and all manner of other social, intellectual, and moral improvements. The city's African Methodist Episcopal Church also funded the building and operation of several free Black schools, an abiding financial commitment to the core belief expressed by the Black schoolmaster William Watkins in 1836 that a good education is the sine qua non as it regards the elevation of our people. By the mid-1840s, Baltimore's AME schools enrolled 600 students. Other denominations had by then begun to follow suit. And by 1860, there were more than a dozen such schools up and running, enrolling roughly 2,600 students across the city. Free Black Baltimoreans built this thriving, resilient community while living under siege. They had to claw and fight for every advantage, no matter how meager, and were checked at every turn by the many white residents of the city who resented their presence. Despite, or perhaps because of, their self-evident industriousness and willingness to work for low wages, their white job competitors lobbied the General Assembly in Annapolis to bar free Black folk from one occupation after another, bad-mouthing free Black folk as indolent, lazy, more easily influenced by temptations to steal, less influenced by the desire of maintaining an honest reputation, and less fearful of the operations of the law than us white people. Racism on these job sites spiked each time the economy in Baltimore faltered. And whenever European migration to the city climbed, each time that happened, white employers and workers closed ranks. By the 1850s, Baltimore was buckling under a wave of job-busting riots on the docks, on the railroads, and everywhere else. Free people of color had had the temerity to labor. In 1858, black bricklayers at one city yard were assaulted by a mob of 30 white men calling themselves the White Tigers. And they were intent, one witness said, on driving out the colored employees and supplanting them in their places. Those black bricklayers had to run for their lives. Pistols and in several instances, guns being fired upon them. The city's free black workers did their best to hold the line, organizing labor unions to boost their wages, insisting that black foremen keep their jobs and trying to achieve collective bargaining. But the attacks on their livelihoods were relentless. And by the eve of the Civil War, various scare tactics had driven African-American caulkers and butchers and carpenters and sawyers and shoemakers and shopkeepers into retreat and out of occupations they had once dominated. The white man now stands in the black man's shoes, or else is fast getting into them, one approving local commentator observed. Black Baltimoreans felt that squeeze wherever they went, and not only at work. White thugs struck at black churches regularly, throwing stones and breaking the doors and windows of the Sharp Street AME Church in West Baltimore during one service in August 1838. That attack caused panic, and many congregants inside were injured by rushing through the doors and jumping out the windows. Unfortunately, city constables usually turned a blind eye to this sort of racial terrorism, and instead embraced the task of enforcing restrictive ordinances that made it illegal for people of color to buy dogs or liquor or tobacco or bacon or beef without special licenses, and that required free people of color to observe a 10 p.m. nightly curfew. Some policemen did far worse, beating legally free black people bloody as a butcher, or throwing them in jail on suspicion of being runaway slaves, as if the fact of their freedom was proof of their criminality. Whatever the alleged crime, the judges and juries of the city's circuit court rarely looked favorably upon defendants of color. As one Baltimore attorney explained, they were inclined to convict a man merely because he was black, often sentencing those convicted of petty crimes of survival, like stealing food or clothes, to being transported out of state, to be sold into slavery. In addition to its many commercial functions, the port of Baltimore was also a major point of embarkation for black migrants to Africa in this period. Plans to banish former slaves from this region had been on the drawing board for decades. And Maryland was home to some of the nation's most prominent proponents of colonization. Colonization is the send them to Africa idea that was popular at the time. Maryland was a big hub for that idea. Beginning in 1826, the Maryland Colonization Society, or MCS, received a $1,000 annual appropriation from the legislature at Annapolis, an extraordinary show of governmental support for its deportation agenda. In the wake of Nat Turner's revolt in nearby Virginia in 1830, the MCS drew new attention and new interest from white Marylanders worried that the state was on its own path to racial uprising, and who were thus now favorably disposed to any practical plan to get rid of the state's free blacks. The MCS, the Maryland Colonization Society, proposed to do just that. And it soon spawned several local subsidiaries, all of them focused on removing newly freed former slaves quickly from Maryland and sending them to Africa. It was a Marylander, Robert Goodloe, I can't say the word, Robert Goodloe Harper, a Marylander, who coined the name Liberia. And in 1831, the MCS sent its first cohort of Black migrants there. 31 made that maiden voyage from Baltimore, and 149 more would follow the next year. Most of them farmers and their families from Worcester County and Somerset County on the Eastern Shore. In 1834, the Maryland Colonization Society, the MCS, established its own resettlement colony independent of Liberia near Cape Palmas. It's called Maryland in Liberia. You can see it here. And over the next 20 years, about 1,000 more voyagers journeyed there through the port of Baltimore, searching for fresh economic opportunities and new lives free from American racism. Looking only at the cumulative number of former slaves who boarded ships in Baltimore, however, obscures much more complicated, much more contested scenes on the city's docks. Let me be very clear here. Most Black Marylanders vigorously opposed colonization. And sometimes they followed neighbors who had chosen to emigrate all the way to the gangplanks of those vessels to plead with them to reconsider. And many did. And MCS officers could persuade only 50 people each year on average to deport themselves. Most ships leaving Baltimore for Africa left half empty, usually carrying more migrants from out of state than from Maryland itself. What's more, those who made these voyages across the ocean often quickly returned to this city, dismayed by the poor conditions they found in Liberia and Maryland in Liberia. In fact, in 1857, the MCS colony collapsed and had to be annexed by neighboring Liberia proper. Most Black Marylanders were naturally suspicious of any plan that had the support of white enslavers, as colonization did. William Watkins, the leading anti-colonization figure in Baltimore City, denounced deportation as a brazen villainy pushed by those who design to make us miserable here, that we may emigrate to Africa with our own consent. Yet Black opposition was never monolithic. And MCS officers worked hard to cultivate enthusiasm for colonization whenever they could. Those opposed to deportation had to organize to resist these propaganda efforts. And they did, by disrupting MCS meetings and by turning churches and other free Black gathering places in this city and across this state into what the historian Ira Berlin has called beehives of anti-colonizationist activity. Maryland Colonization Society agents were not the only Baltimoreans working to siphon off the city's surging free Black population in the second quarter of the century. At that time, Baltimore was well known as a refuge of kidnappers, a safe haven and target-rich environment for bands of vicious opportunists who would prowl the streets and burst into homes to snatch away any person they thought they could sell on to interstate slave traders to carry into the Deep South. They would kidnap free people, is what I'm saying. Not runaways, not fugitives, free people. Kidnapping and human trafficking on this wholly illegal reverse underground railroad carried obvious risks for the kidnappers, both legal and physical, but demand for Black bodies down in the Cotton Kingdom was such that there was a lot of money to be made selling free people from the Chesapeake into slavery on the Gulf Coast. As a writer for one Black newspaper reminded readers in 1840, an able-bodied colored man sells in the Southern market for from $800 to $1,000. By then, free Black Baltimoreans had been fighting off these vultures, these kidnappers, for decades. Because of the size of the city's free Black community, Baltimore had been a den of manhunters since the early 1800s. And over the years, those kidnappers and human traffickers had grown ever more daring in their depredations, sometimes knocking their targets unconscious on city streets in broad daylight, or enlisting older African Americans to lure youngsters into their clutches. By the second quarter of the 19th century, Black boys and girls under the age of 16 had become kidnappers' prime targets. Missing persons ads in Baltimore's papers began to fill with the names of those children. Priscilla Blake, age 14. Eliza Pisco, age 11. Jane Harris, age 10. Henny, age 6. A roll call for a school of lost children. Here's one of those ads. This is for a boy called Cornelius Sinclair, about 11 years old. I wrote a book about him. In the 1850s, men and women in this disgusting line of work stepped up their operations. They took ever more free people of color and tried to pass them off as suspected fugitives, a practice made much easier by the terms of the new Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. As Paulie Murray once observed, these people snatchers cared little whether their victim was a fugitive, a free man, or a freeborn person. It did not matter to kidnappers. Baltimore's slave dealers like Hope Slatter cultivated reputations as respectable businessmen who operated wholly within the law. But as the historian Robert Goodmestad has demonstrated, the reality was quite different. And at one time or another, every major slave trader in the city seems to have dabbled in buying people they knew to have been kidnapped. These monsters operated with what historian Stephen Whitman has called virtual impunity. All too few kidnappers of free Black people served prison terms. And Maryland's governors frequently pardoned or commuted their sentences of the few men and women convicted of abduction, human trafficking, or enslaving. Because free people of color had no reliable allies in state government or city law enforcement, and because only a small core of white activists were willing to lend them any practical aid, they had to defend themselves as best they could. So that's what they did. Free Black people in Baltimore organized themselves into protection societies and neighborhood watches, staying within doors after dark, and hollering, biting, and kicking if a stranger grabbed them and tried to cart them away. They were dogged and determined. But resistance was often futile, and it was always dangerous. When a Black husband clambered up to one of the windows of a rail car to try to stop his legally free wife being sold out of state as a slave, Hope Slatter himself knocked the husband down from the car and ordered him away. Things had not always been so dark, lonely, and desperate in Baltimore. In the 1820s, Baltimore had been a hive of anti-slavery activism and radical interracial politics. In 1824, Benjamin Lundy had moved his crusading anti-slavery newspaper, The Genius of Universal Emancipation, to the city of Baltimore from Tennessee. It was the only explicitly anti-slavery newspaper published in a border state that decade. And Lundy had soon begun churning out a mix of polemical reporting and commentary, including his trademark blacklist, which doggedly documented slavery's daily outrages. A year later, in 1825, a group of white city leaders in Lundy's orbit formed the Maryland Anti-Slavery Society. A rare accomplishment because Maryland was a slave state. Over the next 3 years, that anti-slavery group attracted about 500 members and subscribers and spawned 11 county-level auxiliaries, chapters. In 1827, some of those same activists founded a sister organization. It was called the Baltimore Society for the Protection of Free People of Color. These exciting developments were direct responses to escalating racial oppression. But these were heady days nonetheless for the state's anti-slavery activists. And by the end of the decade, Baltimore had twice hosted the American Convention for promoting the abolition of slavery, drawing delegates from organizations in several states to the city of Baltimore for national assemblies, and confirming Baltimore's emerging reputation as the center of the abolitionist movement. That's the 1820s. By the eve of the Civil War, however, all of that was a distant memory. The enduring influence of slavery's special interests and the crushing weight of rising Negrophobia had long since driven many of the city's white anti-slavery activists to the point of extinction. Having been slandered, spat at, and physically assaulted, Benjamin Lundy had finally fled Baltimore for Washington, D.C. in 1830, taking his newspaper with him. By then, both the Maryland Anti-Slavery Society and the Baltimore Society for the Protection of Free People of Color had folded too, undone by flagging fundraising and by a foolhardy decision by officers to put up overtly anti-slavery candidates in statewide elections. Those who had embraced the cause out of religious obligation were buckling under social and political pressure as well. In 1836, the Baltimore Annual Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church announced its absolute opposition to abolition. A striking turnaround for a group that had once contained several notable emancipationists. 2 years later, in 1838, Maryland's Hicksite Quakers did the same, declaring that their members should avoid becoming further entangled in the anti-slavery cause if they wished to remain in good standing. Stripped of their white allies, Baltimore's African-American population had to soldier on alone, suffering through decades of humiliation and persecution that had all the trappings of a race war unfolding in slow motion. All right. With that, I'm going to say thank you very much indeed for listening. I know this is dark and serious and sobering stuff. I'm hoping we're going to have some questions and comments in the time we have left, but I've also put my email address up on this final slide in case people would prefer to converse privately. And if anyone asks me about my book, I'll happily show you a slide about that. But in the meantime, let me turn things back to David and Alison to see what's next.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So yeah, at this point, we'd be happy to open it up to questions. I see that we have a few questions in the chat from Scott Shane, which I'd be happy to just read, or if he would like to.
Why don't you read? Because I'm bad at that. Go for it. All
right. Well, Scott wanted to know, how does the scale of escapes from Baltimore and the region, how does the scale of escapes from Baltimore and region with the scale of sales in the South?
Yeah, so this is a comparative question, right, about fugitivity in our region, Maryland, versus other regions in the slave South. I think, first of all, hi, Scott. Scott and I are friends. Scott, by the way, if you don't know, folks, is a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter for the New York Times. He's an amazing guy. Thanks for coming out tonight, Scott. It's a great pleasure to be with you. There's a question I think is a comparative question. Yeah, so what historians of running away, historians of fugitivity, historians of the Underground Railroad will tell you is that the ability to escape from slavery has a lot to do with geography, to do with where you are and the type of place in which you live. It also has to do with demographics as well, right? Are you encumbered with, for instance, young children, or are you unencumbered and healthy, right? That also affects whether you can run. But geography is a big determinant. And one of the easiest way to think about this in terms of geographic space is how close is where you live to free soil? Where is legal freedom? How far away is legal freedom? So if you live in Pennsylvania, I'll start that again. If you live in Maryland or in Baltimore, Maryland, then you live relatively close to the Pennsylvania state line compared to someone that lives in South Carolina or someone that lives in Florida or later Texas, right? So Pennsylvania is emerging as free soil. Pennsylvania is one of the first northern states to begin the long, crappy process of disentangling itself from race slavery. It does that in a law that is passed in 1780 and that is still slowly taking effect decades later, but it's getting the job done, however slowly. So Pennsylvania is free soil, effectively speaking, especially after 1820 or so. And so if you can make it to the Pennsylvania line, then slavery doesn't exist in the eyes of the state of Pennsylvania as a legal institution. And what that means in practice is that Pennsylvania has become a magnet for free Black people or people seeking freedom who are Black. And so if you are a runaway who can make it to Pennsylvania or to Philadelphia especially, you can hide in plain sight alongside and among a lot of Black people who do actually have their papers on them, who are actually legally free. And that hiding in plain sight makes Philadelphia a magnet. So how far away are you from Philadelphia? That's one way to think about your chances of getting free. And it's not just Philadelphia, of course. Think about, Western Pennsylvania. Think about Pittsburgh. Think about Cincinnati, Ohio as other major destinations for freedom seekers. Well, what that means is that enslaved people who live in the border states that touch Ohio and Pennsylvania have a better geographic shot of making it to that soil. So that's why Maryland is actually a major origin point of enslaved people seeking freedom in Pennsylvania. And the closer you are to the line, the Maryland-Pennsylvania line, the more the numbers rise. In fact, as I write in the longer paper, Scott, the 6 counties along the top of Maryland that touch that Pennsylvania line, they are emptying out of enslaved people, because one by one, those folks are walking 5 miles or 10 miles. They're still at great risk, but the distances are just much more manageable than if you live in, say, the Richmond area or Macon, Georgia, or somewhere like that. Because if you live down there, your options are really limited to running into the woods, in the forests or the swamps, and becoming a sort of what's called a maroon, someone who's run away, but who's not living among white urban communities, for instance, living in the woods. Or you need to get to a port, a deep water Atlantic port or a Gulf Coast port where you can stow away on a ship and hope that that ship can cover vast distances. And that happens, by the way. Charleston, South Carolina does emerge as a major point of embarkation for fugitives, and they're all going on ships bound for New York or New Bedford, Mass, or somewhere like that, maybe even Canada directly. So the short answer is that geography matters. And because Maryland and Baltimore are, by comparison to other slave states, relatively close to free soil, their numbers are pretty swollen in terms of how many people attempt to get to free soil. You see much lower numbers in North Carolina, for instance, or Tennessee, for instance. So geography is a big deal.
And Scott also wanted to know what drove the growth of the free Black population in Baltimore, manumission or otherwise?
Yeah, so it's a few different things, right? So with Baltimore, it's always complicated, right? Because it's this city in a slave state, which has a large free population of Black people. And that's odd, right? You have to sort of slow down and think what I just said to make sense of it, right? It has a large free Black population in a city in which slavery is definitely legal, and there are plenty of enslaved people too. So how does Baltimore rise to become a city with so many free Black people? There's a few different answers here. One is to say that there have frequently been individual slave owners, individual enslavers, who have chosen to give freedom, grant freedom to individual people they own. This is a process called manumission, M-A-N-U-M-I-S-S-I-O-N. And it's an individual process for an individual property holder to release their property and turn that property back in the eyes of the law into a person. Now, enslaved people lobby relentlessly to be given their freedom, to be manumitted. Oftentimes they're refused. Sometimes, however, their enslavers will say, okay, but there are strings attached. The string attached is, I'll do it in my will when I'm dead. That's what George Washington in Virginia does, by the way, right? He only manumits people after he's dead, after he can't lose out. But that's how some people get legally free. They're manumitted when their owner dies. Another path is their owner says, okay, if you promise not to run away for the next 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and you promise to work super hard, much harder than I've ever seen you work before for the next 5, 6, or 7 years, I promise I will free you on this future date. That's called a future freedom agreement, right? That's another source of manumission. And the other is a purchase agreement. The enslaver says to the enslaved person, okay, I want you to buy your freedom from me. I'm going to tell you how much your freedom is worth, and then you're going to scrape and save up the money over the next however many years it takes you by doing odd jobs for my neighbors to accrue that money. If you ever heard of Richard Allen, the famous Philadelphia Black preacher, that's exactly how he got free. His owner in Delaware said, okay, if you can come up with $2,000, I will let you buy your freedom. $2,000 is a ridiculous amount of money back then. And the owner thinks it's going to take Richard at least 5 years to chop enough wood for all his neighbors to earn some side cash. Richard, of course, is highly motivated by the fact he's got a deal on the table here. He raises $2,000 through side gigs in 3 years and buys his freedom in 1783. So purchase agreements, future freedom, or death of the owner are three sources of manumission. And if you're manumitted, then you're supposed to get your freedom papers, right? A piece of paper says he's legit, he's legally free. Here's the paper to prove it. Here's the bill of sale saying I sold his freedom back to him. That is a major source of the free Black population in Baltimore, especially after 1790. For about 20 years after the American Revolution, Baltimore and Maryland relax their restrictions on manumission so that people who want to free their slaves can actually now do so. It had been harder before the revolution. So manumission is one source of the free Black population. The next source of the free Black population is those legally free people having children, of course, and grandchildren, natural reproduction. And the other source is fugitivity, that people who are legally enslaved run away to Baltimore and hide among people who are legally free, right? This is what Harriet Tubman does when she runs to Philadelphia from the Eastern Shore, right? She's not free, but she hides out among free people and likes to be mistaken for a free person. Frederick Douglass will do that when he runs to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And it won't be several more years until he's able to make himself legally free by raising $700 to buy his freedom. So those are the three sources: manumission, fugitivity, and biological reproduction, under which the free Black population of Baltimore rises very quickly, I would say, to a very large number by the standards of the day.
Could you comment on the role of advertisements that sought the return of runaway slaves in helping us understand the broader picture of fugitivity? For example, they help us discern where escapes tended to occur, methods used to escape, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that. So, I don't know where you guys all grow up, but I get the sense now that every K-12 student in America these days is required to read some runaway slave ads at some point in their education. For those of us in the education game, like David Arminty and me, we use runaway slave ads, as they used to be called, pretty commonly in classroom settings. Now, these are ads put in local papers by enslavers whose human property has run away. And the slave owner, the enslaver, wants them back. And they say, have you seen my slave? My slave looks like this. And they give often very fulsome physical descriptions of the person who's run away. Sometimes they'll even offer a listing of their skills. The guy can speak English really well, or he thinks he's a good carpenter, or something like that. And they'll also describe, any physical scarring they have, the tone of their skin, whether they're missing a front tooth, various things. And they'll say, we think he's headed for Baltimore, for instance, or we think he got on a ship in Baltimore, he's going to New York, or whatever it might be. So you can imagine that over the generations, historians have found these runaway slave ads to be a complete goldmine of information about the enslaved people their owners are describing, because most enslaved people could not read or write. Some could, but most couldn't. And we don't have, letters and diaries from most enslaved people. And most slave owners do not spend all their regular days describing what their enslaved workers are doing or wearing. It's only in these moments when those people run away that slave owners say, hold on, what did that guy look like? Let me remember as much as I can and put it all in 200 words and publish it in a newspaper. And newspapers are vastly more likely to survive to today than almost any other type of source from that period. So they're a goldmine for historians of slavery. We can use all sorts of things in them to answer questions we care about. Like, for instance, how common was corporal punishment, being whipped in slavery? If you can look at all the references to scarring on bodies and faces, you get a sense of that. How quickly did smallpox or yellow fever spread in certain cities? References to pockmarks on their faces can be ways to track those public health questions. Demographics, the size of family groups can all be, deduced from some of that information. So they're incredibly rich. Now, we're always getting an enslaver's view, right? So we're always getting a sort of white male racist gaze on a black person. And so it's important to always sort of remember that. But nonetheless, they're some of the richest sources we have. And by the way, there's several projects which have tried to gather up as many runaway slave ads as they can and make them available for the general public. So if you'd like to see a whole bunch of them, and you'd like to see what you can figure out about American slavery or freedom seeking or whatever your interests are, go to a website like Freedom on the Move. I think it's freedomonthemove.org, but I'll have David check if you don't mind. Freedomonthemove.org. This is a site out of Cornell University and the team there, which has tried to collect as many of these runaway slave ads as possible and make them digitally readable, so you can see the original image and you can see a transcription, and then you can search for keywords across thousands and thousands of these things and start to learn things from that big data project. This is called Digital Humanities, and it's all the rage right now on campuses like mine. Freedomonthemove.org, I think it is a great site to check out.
And of course, in Maryland, we have the Legacy of Slavery Project, of which Allison and I are both graduates, so to speak, from our earlier days in the field. So another great resource. And I have a question, and there may be a few other questions coming in, but as some folks start to filter out, I do want to just take a moment to acknowledge our sponsors for the Baltimore History Evenings series, Arcadia Publishing and Trace Architects, who have generously sponsored this year and past seasons. And I also just want to clarify for our audience that our June talk is our speaker has had to pull out for personal reasons. So we're in the process of seeing if we can replace that. So keep an eye on our page and our various feeds to see as we fill that spot. So we've had some other comments in the chat about some of the items that you've addressed and some additional resources that folks can check out. But I was wondering, you spoke, it's very striking to think about how the abolition community basically seems to dry up in the space of a decade. And, in addition to Benjamin Lundy, you also have folks like William Lloyd Garrison, who spend time in Baltimore, I think working for Lundy, if I'm not mistaken, at the newspaper that you mentioned. Did you get a sense that some of that community perhaps went underground? Did some of those folks maintain activities in and around the city, or did it just become too volatile that it almost literally vacated the space, for fear, and also just it just was not practically working there anymore?
Yeah, I think that's a really smart question, David. So it pushes up against these, what is a generalization I offered, right? To say that, white-led anti-slavery activism collapses by 1830. I would stand by the general picture that it's a declining and collapsing center, but there's of course more nuance to it, right? When you start to ferret around in the sources. And there are plenty of white people in Baltimore who are uneasy about slavery and slave trading and kidnapping, but the costs to them of speaking out publicly only rise in Maryland and in Baltimore after 1830, which is one reason why folks who have genuine, burning convictions who are white about slavery tend to go somewhere else after 1830, right? As I mentioned, Lundy goes to Washington. William Lloyd Garrison, who trains under Lundy, I think in Baltimore, will go on to Boston, Massachusetts, and lead his national anti-slavery campaign from the relative geographic safety of Boston, Massachusetts. If you live in a slave state and you're a white person with anti-slavery principles, it's very hard to do that, to speak them out loud as time goes on. For Black people, of course, their freedom of movement is much more restricted, and none of their options about where they should go are great. You can be a free Black person in Philadelphia and be subject to all the same racism, discrimination, and social exclusion that free Black people in Baltimore suffer under. The same is true for Boston, one of the most racist cities in America, New York as well. There's no safe place in America if you're free or Black. You will always face discrimination and racism, and even your freedom will continually be fragile wherever you go. Kidnappers stalk every place with the free Black population, whether it's Baltimore or whether it's New York or Boston or Philadelphia. Black people, however, who remain in Baltimore, they certainly remain active. And I would say if you're looking for expressions of anti-slavery sentiment in Baltimore after 1830, you're just as likely to find them in the free Black community as you are in sort of a white community there. So it's a nuanced picture, but back in the 1820s, when Baltimore briefly seems to be a sort of hub of anti-slavery activism, it's not at all clear that Maryland's going to stick with slavery. The economic case for slavery in parts of the state of Maryland has been slowly undercut by all sorts of geopolitical changes, like the Haitian Revolution, and also by economic changes, like the continued switch away from tobacco towards wheat, which is a far less slavery-dependent crop. So in the 1820s, if you're a white abolitionist in Baltimore, a white anti-slavery activist in Baltimore, you might think that you're going to win this fight, and that 10 years from now, slavery will be dead in Maryland. Now, you, of course, will be wrong, but you live with that real optimism and hope in the 1820s. By the 1840s, the notion that Maryland's going to step away from slavery is largely vanished. Nat Turner's rebellion in 1830 in our region, the Chesapeake, is a big decision point for state legislators in Maryland and Delaware and Virginia. Are we going to shut up shop with the slavery because we're terrified of another slave revolt? Are we going to pack it in? Or are we going to double down and just make the prospect of a revolt even harder by further restricting the mobility of enslaved people? And we know that state legislators in our region choose to double down on slavery. And as you all know, Maryland will remain a slave state throughout the Civil War. And I think, David, it's not until the 1864 constitutional amendment that the state of Maryland changes its mind about that. So the moment of optimism, maybe Maryland's going to make a move against slavery, which is very real in the 1820s, has certainly disappeared 15, 20 years later.
And yeah, I don't want to hijack the question and answer and comment section here, but this all reminds me of another book that actually your colleague Dr. Christopher Bonner at University of Maryland, his recent publication Remaking the Republic, also touches on a lot of these dynamics around Black political activism in the North, as well as in border states like Maryland, and the threat of captivity or capture and promoting that. So we'll just add to our listeners' reading list here to go out and grab that one as well, in addition to Stolen and Reconsidering. Our board president, Heather Hairston, also pointed out the Harriet Tubman Visitor Center has a great interactive educational exhibit. That's one I have to add to my list now, where you're shown the risks that fugitive slaves faced in reaching safety. So sounds like a great resource, and something that our listeners here will also want to check out. So looking through the chat, I think we've gotten through the questions that are out there. Again, if anybody wants to unmute and take any last questions, last question or two, we could do that.
Good. In the meantime, I would just say, in case you missed it, this is my book about some of these issues. This is a book about Philadelphia. It's not about Baltimore. Let me say that right up front. But I wrote it, I'm proud of it. And if you haven't seen it and you'd like to take a look at it, check your local library. Or if for some reason you'd like a signed copy, then send me an email at the email address you see on the screen. Covers many of the same themes we discussed tonight, but with a focus on 1820s Philadelphia. And yeah, the book by my colleague Christopher Bonner is called Remaking the Republic. It's excellent. And then I mentioned in passing, one of my friends and colleagues who's teaches at Johns Hopkins, that's Martha Jones. She's a contributor to the volume of essays that we've been mentioning tonight, The Civil War in Maryland Reconsidered. Martha's also the author of many prize-winning books, one of which is about Black citizenship in Baltimore. And that book is called Birthright Citizens, if I'm remembering correctly. Birthright Citizens by Martha Jones. Do take a look at that book if you'd like to go much deeper on the lives of free Black Baltimoreans and their political consciousness and activism in this period.
All excellent reads for sure. Well, I think that's it for us this evening. We just everyone wants to thank Dr. Richard Bell so much for joining us and spending time with us tonight. And again, for our regular listeners and folks that follow the Baltimore History Evenings, we are working to set up a new June speaker, and we'll certainly reach out to our folks by email and other channels to let them know if and when we pull that together. But thank you to Dr. Bell, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Be happy and healthy.
Thank you.